Yeah, I don't imagine. But it's like
You'll notice that we're in the heart of the old Flemish, the old Huguenot quarter, and a lot of these very old houses were designed for weavers. Often the top story was where they had very large windows, so they could actually have the spinning frames there. And they actually grew their own mulberry trees, and you need mulberry trees in order to have silkworms. They used to breed the silkworms. I'm going to show you where the very last mulberry tree is left in East London later on. But we'll go through here and you'll see some very handsome houses. They're excellent little houses, and I'll explain about them later.
I had a really nice time. I don't really know what happened. Well, I do. I drank too much, but like there's like that.
More old Flemish, old Huguenot houses.
Yeah, no, it was
Harriet.
This is Christ Church Hall. It originally started actually as a Huguenot church, and then it became, you can read all about it. It became a German Lutheran church in 1787, then a Baptist one, and it reflects the. There's another place down there, originally a Huguenot church. Then it became a Jewish synagogue, and now it's one of the main mosques of the area. So it shows you the constant changes in population. Now, this is very much connected with radicalism in the East End. It became a meeting place known as Christ Church Hall. And in 1888, Annie Besant, who was involved in organising the Match Girls strike, addressed a very large meeting here. I'll just put this down for a minute. And it was the scene of various other meetings over the course of the next few years. A whole series of tailor strikes took place here watch out behind you, from the 1880s right into the 1900s, and there were mass meetings here in that period. In 1889, Eleanor Marx, who was one of Karl Marx's daughters, addressed the massive dock workers' strike. If you like, the Brighton May Match Girls strike ignited a whole wave of strikes, not just in the East End, but right through Britain, with all these new unions emerging, more militant, who were trying to organise what you call general workers' unions on a general basis. But also, interesting point. There was we'll talk about this later, but there was an anarchist paper called it's a Yiddish paper. So that's the language of East European Jews, called Der Arbeiterfreund, which meant the worker's friend. And in its early days, there was a rather fascinating character called Benjamin Feigenbaum, which I think means fig tree. Anyway, just besides the point. And in its early days, the early socialists and anarchists associated. Why are they fucking parking here? Associated with the Arbeiterfreund, actually carried out this a very sort of virulent anti-religious propaganda against the Orthodox Jews. For example, probably very unwisely, they used to stand outside of synagogues and wave ham sandwiches and pork sausages, which probably wasn't the right thing to do, as they were attacked and stoned. But one of the things that Feigenbaum did was he had a mass meeting here and on the subject of does God exist, and he said, oh, if God exists, then I urge him now to strike me down with a bolt of lightning. I'm going to wait 2 minutes. He waited 2 minutes, and he wasn't struck down. So there you go. And that was at a mass meeting. Now, further down at 167, we're not going to go there because he's not there anymore, was a pub called the Sugarloaf Pub, and this is where anarchists used to meet from 1892 onwards. There was a very large hall in the back of the pub. You had to they had to go through the front of the pub, which is often full of drunks. So, you know, and they didn't like local drunks, and they didn't like Jews very much, so you often had to put up with a lot of racial abuse. But in the back was a big hall where the anarchists used to meet. And well, surprise, the Daily Mail of all papers launched, even at that time, they were vile. They launched a hate campaign against the anarchists, and they said that the anarchists were making a web at the Sugarloaf Pub and attracting all these naive people into their clutches. So that's what happened at 167. Further up, at number 71, was a bookshop, anarchist bookshop. It was a bookshop and newsagent, and it dealt in it sold all sorts of Russian language and Yiddish language newspapers, and it was run by this anarchist couple called Baruch and Rose Ruderman. They'd originally come from Lithuania, and they used their bookshop as a way to get Yiddish and Russian language stuff back into the Russian Empire under the autocracy of the Tsar. So it was quite an important thing. They're also famous because there was a Russian revolutionary called Burtsev, and he was in exile in Britain at that time. So the special branch, under the influence of the Tsarist regime, actually started visiting places, and they purchased newspapers. They purchased Burtsev's newspaper at the shop down the road, and they said that he was inciting people to kill the Tsar. Seems fair enough to me. But he was done on that, and he actually served time for it. They weren't prosecuted, but he was. And the Tsar thanked the evil, and I call him evil, the Inspector Neville, one of the founders of the Special Branch. You know, this was back in the 1880s. One of the founders of the Special Branch, still going down. They rewarded him and his wife with gold jewellery. What is that? Isn't that some form of corruption? I would have thought. There you go. Anyway, any questions so far? All right. Before we're going to talk about the history of the Jewish working class in the East End before we proceed to Gun Street. Now, there have been Jews in this country for a very, very long time. The first wave of Jews, I mean, they've been here for an extremely long time, since the Middle Ages. And the first group were the Sephardic Jews who came from Portugal and Spain. So you got famous people, you know, who became very wealthy, some of them. Disraeli was actually a prime minister. He was Jewish, very flamboyant character. And they're like
Disraeli, the author?
He was an author and he was prime minister. Yes, he wrote Coningsby, didn't he? I think that's one of his things. And he dressed in a very extravagant way as well. You know, yellow gloves, very loud waistcoats, etc., etc., velvet suits, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. Quite a character, really.
What was that?
This was in the 19th century. He's one of the British prime ministers. He was a conservative. Yes. anyway, that's that wave of Jews. But they lived inside the gates of the city, as it were, you know, on the within the confines of the city. Some lived over in Marble Arch as well. But the wave of Jews who came into this area, which is, you know, this area is outside the old city, yeah, were Jews from Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish, which is a sort of language very similar to German. I think the Germans can more or less understand it. And it's got some Hebrew words in it and some Russian words in it. It's mostly German. And they weren't like the Sephardic Jews who managed to become quite wealthy, well, at least most of them. They came from a very impoverished background. They came from these poor communities called shtetls in the East End. Are you part of the group?
Oh, no. It's just,
All right, yeah. Listen. No, carry on. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Tsarist Empire, and it was regularly used as a weapon to divide the Russian working class. And there's a whole series of pogroms, that is, you know, attacking the Jewish communities, raping
the Black
women,
Hundreds,
battering the Black Hundreds, who were this sort of proto-fascist, very racist group, who, with the connivance of the police, attacked the Jewish population, raped women, you know, mass rape, killed people, threw people out a window, robbed all their possessions, and this happened on a number of occasions. The worst one was in what is now Moldova, in the capital of Moldova, which is known as the Kishinev outrage. But I mean, it got really bad after the Tsar, Alexander III, was assassinated, and this set off another wave of anti-Semitism. So each time that happened, more and more people came flooding into Britain, and they came via the Baltic. And they landed up in the basin, which is now by the Tower of London. Now, obviously, around here it was very poor, so there's a lot of cheap accommodation. People, for example, in Hanbury Street, they rammed people in. You know, huge numbers of people into you know, 17, 18, 19, 20 people into very small rooms. And there was also, they rammed a lot of people into very small workshops as well. So, you know, they were living in terrible conditions in their own homes, and they're living in terrible conditions where they were working. And one of the other things that attracted Jewish people to the East End was that a number of soup kitchens were set up in the area. I'm going to show you where the last surviving one is. There was one that was set up on Breck Lane, but we're going to go down and have a look at the last one, which is rather a fine building as well. Okay, any questions? All right. A lot of the streets. Oh, look, there's a nice pussycat there. A lot of the streets are named after the local industries. Look, there's Gun Street. Now, that number was where the first socialist club, the very first socialist club in East London was set up. And it was set up by this personage, this character called Aaron Lieberman. Let's see. Yeah, he arrived here in 1875. He'd been in training to be a rabbi in a seminary in Vilna, which is the capital of
Lithuania.
And he was expelled there in 1872 on the grounds that he was both an atheist and a socialist. So obviously you can't be a rabbi if you're an atheist. That's fair enough. And he, you know, there was all this radicalism was happening inside the Russian Empire at the time. So people who, you know, young people, young men and women, very idealistic young men and women, from the upper classes, from from the intelligentsia, from the aristocracy. They rallied to the cause of the revolution because they saw how corrupt and awful the Tsarist autocracy was, and he was one of the people who rallied to the cause. And as he said, he tried to go to the people. And as a friend of his said, we had broken away from the culture of the Russian Jews of that period. We had a negative attitude to the bourgeois and orthodox sections. As for the Jewish working masses, we believed that the liberation of the Russian nation would also liberate all the other nationalities in Russia. And Vilna at that time was a hotbed of agitation. Lieberman spoke several European languages as well as Hebrew, and he was a fiery orator as well. And so he worked to get socialist literature published in Vilna in Yiddish, which I mentioned earlier. But he had to get out because things were getting too hot for him there. The Sigma police were after him, so he had to leave. And he took up compositing, you know, when you put typeface on a case. It's a typesetter, basically. He took part in the Paris Commune in 1871, the uprising of the French Parisian working class. And he eventually came to Britain in 1876, and he set it up in the first socialist club. The first is called the Hebrew Socialist Club. Hebrew was often used as an alternative word for Jewish, a sort of euphemism, if you like. And he was secretary of this Hebrew Socialist Union. And used to have a maximum of about 40 people who used to attend meetings. It wasn't just political subjects, it was all sorts of cultural things as well. They discussed philosophy, art, everything, you know. I mean, socialist and anarchist education at that time was about improving yourself. You learnt about things. Shame it's not like that now. You know, people read, they looked at architecture, art, or poetry, or novels, all of those sorts of things. But he attracted the attention of the Orthodox establishment, the Orthodox Jewish establishment, and they started publishing things about him in their newspapers. And he was actually physically attacked on the street by some of the establishment's henchmen. Now, unfortunately, he fell in love with the wife of one of his comrades, and
is that what socialists do anyway?
Yes, they do. It happens. It happens, people. You're a human being. He fell in love with her. She rejected him, and then she fled to New York. So we followed her there. I suppose you could call that stalking. Not really. But she again rejected him. She said, "Sorry, Aaron, I'm not interested." So he blew his brains out in a little hotel room. And that was a sad end of Aaron Lieberman. Right. Now, I mentioned the Dutch Jews. I mean, because there's waves of Jews, you know, mostly from East Europe. But the first strike was the Dutch Jews. They settled in just down there in Cobb Street, Leyden Street, and Toynbee Street. That was in the 1850s. And they made cigars and cigarettes. And they had their first strike there in 1858. Yeah. And we'll have a look at those streets as we go by. Before Lieberman came, there was another Jewish activist called Louis Smith, and he'd been involved in the Polish uprising against the Russian Empire in 1863 and the Paris Commune. And he tried to form. He was the first one who tried to form a union of Lithuanian Jewish tailors in Whitechapel. He enrolled a grand total of 72 altogether in this union, but it collapsed after a fortnight. And he went off to New York as well. And that was the very first attempt to organise tailors in the East End. There's a whole history of organising tailors. Okay.